When most people reach their early 70s, their brain has physically shrunk by roughly 5%, and for some, the loss is dramatically worse. This isn't just a figure of speech, it's a documented, measurable fact, confirmed by brain scans taken from thousands of individuals across North America and Europe. The hippocampus, which acts as the brain's central filing system for memories, can lose up to 2% of its volume each year after 60 in certain people. And emerging evidence suggests this deterioration kicks off much earlier, quietly accelerating through our 40s. We're told this is just aging. But is it? Really? Here's what you need to sit with. The human brain wasn't designed to decay. It was engineered to be maintained, actively, at a cellular level, by a set of biological inputs that our modern food supply no longer reliably delivers. In fact, 3 specific categories of food, which now form the backbone of the Western diet, aren't just failing to feed the brain. They are actively speeding up its physical destruction, and the timing is critical. After the age of 45, the brain enters a phase of unique structural fragility. This is a period where the raw materials it gets from food matter more than ever, and where the cumulative damage from years of poor dietary choices compounds in ways we're only just beginning to understand. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I've spent decades researching how the human body was built to move, to consume, to think, and to survive. My goal is to help you understand why your ancient biology is clashing with a radically new world, and how to align the two instead of fighting against them. If you find this perspective valuable, applying evolutionary logic to modern problems, consider subscribing. This isn't about chasing viral trends, it's about following the evidence. To grasp what's really happening inside a modern brain after 45, we have to travel back, not decades, but hundreds of thousands of years. The human brain is, by any measure, the most energy-hungry organ in the animal kingdom. It accounts for just 2% of our body weight, yet it burns through 20% of all the energy we consume at rest. For infants, that number climbs to over 60%. No other mammal on Earth makes this kind of investment, and it wasn't accidental. The massive growth of the human brain over the past 2 million years, from a volume of about 400 cubic centimeters to the 1,300 to 1,400 we carry today, was directly tied to a fundamental change in what we ate. Specifically, the consistent intake of long-chain polyunsaturated fats, especially DHA, appears to have been the structural foundation for that growth. Here's why that's crucial. DHA isn't just fuel, it's the building material. Roughly 60% of the brain's dry weight is fat, and a huge chunk of that fat is DHA, concentrated most heavily in the gray matter of the prefrontal cortex, in the membranes where neurons connect, and within the cellular structure of the hippocampus. DHA keeps neuronal membranes fluid and flexible, allowing them to form and reform connections rapidly. Without enough DHA, those membranes become rigid and slow. This isn't a wellness theory, it's hard biochemistry. For most of human history, this requirement was naturally met by the environment. Coastal populations thrived on fish and shellfish. Inland groups accessed DHA through organ meats, particularly the brain tissue of animals, which is incredibly rich in this fat. The fat composition of wild game also differs drastically from modern farmed animals. It's leaner and has a far healthier balance of omega-3s. The ancestral ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats was estimated to be between 2-to-1 and 4-to-1. Today, on a standard Western diet, that ratio is often between 15-to-1 and 25-to-1. We haven't just changed what we eat, we've changed the molecular blueprint for our brains. That shift isn't just a dietary change. It's a change in the fundamental ingredients available to construct and maintain the brain. And here's the part we rarely hear. The brain is never static. It's constantly remodeling itself. Synaptic connections are rebuilt, neural pathways are reinforced, and inflammatory reactions are triggered and resolved. All of this requires specific molecular ingredients. The quality of those ingredients dictates the quality of the final structure. Your brain, after 45, isn't simply decaying. It's continuously rebuilding itself using whatever modern food provides. And that's where the trouble begins. Let's get specific. I'm not going to tell you that bad food is bad for your brain. That's obvious. Instead, let's look at the specific mechanisms by which 3 food categories exploit the aging brain's vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that become more pronounced after 45 due to changes in how the brain handles inflammation, energy metabolism, and cellular repair. The first category is industrially refined seed oils. This requires context because it's a story about molecular competition, and it's far more significant than most nutrition conversations suggest. Refined seed oils, like soybean, corn, and cottonseed oil, are packed with linoleic acid, a primary omega-6 fat. These oils flooded the food system in the mid-20th century, driven by agricultural policies and the rise of processed foods. They're now in everything: baked goods, salad dressings, chips, and restaurant fried foods. The issue? Linoleic acid and DHA fight for the same enzymatic pathways in your body. When you consume massive amounts of linoleic acid, it elbows out the omega-3 pathway. DHA incorporation into brain cells is reduced. Meanwhile, the excess omega-6s are converted into inflammatory compounds. Over years, this leads to a slow but measurable shift in the molecular makeup of your brain tissue itself. Brain scans from multiple long-term studies show a direct link between a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio and reduced gray matter volume in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, the very areas hit hardest by age-related cognitive decline. Your body isn't failing when it struggles to maintain brain structure on a diet of industrial oils. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, using whatever building material is most available. The design is sound, the inputs are the problem. The second food category is refined grains and added sugar. Here, the mechanism shifts from molecular displacement to metabolic disruption. This is one of the most clinically documented pathways to brain decline. Our brains evolved in an environment of food scarcity. Energy-dense foods like ripe fruit, honey, and starchy tubers were seasonal. Our strong preference for sweet, calorie-rich foods was adaptive. It drove foraging behavior that kept our ancestors alive. That instinct is still intact, but now it operates in a world where refined carbohydrates, white bread, pasta, sugary drinks, and pastries are available 24/7 in massive quantities. Consuming these foods causes rapid, large spikes in blood sugar, followed by massive insulin releases. In the short term, the body handles it. But over decades, especially with low activity levels, this drives chronic insulin resistance. And here's why that matters for your brain. The brain has its own insulin signaling system. Neurons depend on insulin not just for energy intake, but for synaptic flexibility, cell survival, and clearing out waste proteins that accumulate in neurodegenerative diseases. When the brain becomes insulin resistant, this entire process breaks down. Some researchers now refer to advanced Alzheimer's as a form of cerebral insulin resistance, or type 3 diabetes. What's clear is that chronic blood sugar issues aren't just a heart or metabolic risk. They directly affect the structural integrity of the aging brain. A large 2023 meta-analysis found that diets with a high glycemic index were linked to significantly faster shrinkage of the hippocampus over time, regardless of total calories consumed. After 45, the brain's ability to handle these metabolic insults declines. Blood flow regulation worsens, and inflammatory responses to metabolic stress linger longer. The window of vulnerability opens wider. The third food category is ultra-processed meats. This includes commercially produced cured meats like hot dogs, deli slices with nitrite preservatives, and processed sausages. The mechanism here is different again. It involves a class of compounds called nitrosamines. Nitrites are added to processed meats as preservatives and color stabilizers. Under certain conditions, particularly in the acidic environment of the stomach, they react with amines in the protein to form nitrosamines. Several of these are classified as probable carcinogens, and a growing body of research links them to a distinct pathway of neural damage: mitochondrial dysfunction in neurons. Neurons are incredibly energy-demanding cells. They depend on healthy mitochondria, the power plants within each cell, to sustain activity and maintain repair processes. Nitrosamines appear to interfere with mitochondrial function, specifically in brain tissue, generating oxidative stress and insulin resistance within neurons. Research from Brown University has shown that nitrosamine exposure creates damage patterns in brain tissue that mirror early neurodegenerative disease, impaired insulin signaling, increased oxidative stress, and disrupted energy metabolism. This suggests that long-term dietary exposure to nitrosamine precursors may be a meaningful contributor to age-related cognitive decline, especially in populations where processed meats are a daily staple. This isn't a reason for alarm, it's a reason for attention. 3 food categories, 3 distinct biological mechanisms, 1 shared outcome: accelerated structural decay of the tissue the human brain spent 2 million years building. But there's another layer to this story, one that connects these 3 foods through a 4th pathway: the gut-brain axis. You see, the trillions of microbes living in your intestines form a complex ecosystem that constantly communicates with your brain via the vagus nerve, immune signaling, and short-chain fatty acids. When you regularly consume refined seed oils, high sugar, and processed meats, you shift the composition of your gut microbiome toward species that produce inflammatory byproducts and reduce the production of beneficial compounds like butyrate. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid that strengthens the blood-brain barrier, reduces neuroinflammation, and supports the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus. A diet rich in these 3 categories essentially starves the gut microbes that protect your brain, while feeding those that promote systemic inflammation. So the damage isn't only from what these foods do directly to your neurons, it's also from what they do to your internal garden of microbes that, in turn, shape your brain's environment. Let's pause. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Your brain isn't passively aging, it's constantly rebuilding itself. And the quality of that rebuild depends entirely on what you consistently feed it. Those three food categories, industrial oils, refined grains, and processed meats, are undermining that process through displacement, metabolic chaos, cellular energy sabotage, and disruption of your gut ecosystem. This isn't a personal weakness, it's an evolutionary design meeting an environment it was never prepared for. Now let's go deeper. The most crucial insight isn't just about the three foods. It's about what happens in the brain after 45 that makes these inputs so much more damaging than they were at 30. The conversation around midlife brain health focuses almost exclusively on what to add: more omega-3s, more antioxidants, more brain games. But the more important question is about a fundamental shift in the brain's internal economy that occurs in the mid-40s. A shift that changes how vulnerable the brain becomes to exactly the inputs we've been discussing. Using PT scans, researchers have made a striking observation over the past decade. In a significant number of cognitively normal adults, brain glucose metabolism begins to decline in their mid-40s. This isn't limited to people who are metabolically unhealthy. It appears to precede any detectable cognitive change by 10 to 15 years. In other words, the brain's metabolic infrastructure starts to shift long before any symptoms show up. The leading hypothesis is that this reflects a transition in the brain's preferred fuel source. Under optimal ancestral conditions, the aging brain gradually shifts toward a greater reliance on ketones, a byproduct of fat metabolism, as a supplemental energy source. This isn't a modern biohack. It's an ancient metabolic adaptation, a biological backup plan for times when carbohydrates were scarce. What happens when a brain attempting this metabolic transition is flooded with refined carbs, high insulin, displaced omega-3 architecture, and mitochondrial disruption from nitrosamines? The transition stalls. The backup energy system requires metabolic flexibility, but chronic high insulin actively suppresses fat mobilization and ketone production. A brain caught in a constant high glucose, high insulin environment at exactly the moment it needs to develop metabolic flexibility is being denied the very adaptation it was designed to make. This is one of the most underappreciated mismatches in the entire field of brain aging. Think about the practical implications. Consider a retired teacher, someone who spent decades in intellectually demanding work. She's not sedentary. She follows general health advice reasonably well, but her diet has quietly accumulated decades of refined grains, cooking oils, and regular deli sandwiches. She's not eating what anyone would call a terrible diet. She's eating a thoroughly normal, modern diet. Her brain at 58 is attempting a metabolic transition that a constant stream of refined carbs and industrial fats is quietly obstructing. Meanwhile, it's lacking the molecular architecture it needs to maintain synaptic density in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. She may not notice anything yet. The brain has remarkable redundancy, but the structural divergence between what her brain is building and what it evolved to build is real, and it's accumulating. This is the deeper issue, not a dramatic, sudden decline, but a quiet divergence from structural potential. And here's a culturally contrarian observation. This isn't primarily a story about individual discipline or personal failure. It's a story about an industrial food system that systematically replaced the molecular inputs the human brain evolved to require with cheaper, shelf-stable, hyper-palatable alternatives, and did so in a span of 60 to 80 years, far too fast for any biological adaptation to keep up. The brain didn't change, the food supply changed. I want to be careful here because this isn't a prescription, and I'm not your doctor. What I can offer is an evolutionary framework for thinking clearly about environment design. The evolutionary lens doesn't tell us to pursue extreme dietary protocols. It tells us to reduce the gap between what our biology expects and what our environment actually provides. That's an achievable shift for most people, and it's far more sustainable than willpower-dependent restriction. The first and most structurally important step is reducing the displacement of omega-3s in the brain's building materials. This doesn't require expensive supplements. It requires changing the fat that is most consistently present in your diet. Replace refined seed oils in cooking and food prep with fats that don't compete destructively with the omega-3 pathway. Olive oil, for example, is high in oleic acid and doesn't exacerbate the omega-6 displacement problem. This meaningfully changes the molecular raw material available to the brain over months and years. Including regular oily fish, sardines, mackerel, herring, or wild salmon, provides the preformed DHA the brain can incorporate directly, bypassing the conversion pathway that becomes inefficient with age. Where fresh fish is costly, canned sardines and mackerel are among the most affordable and nutrient-dense options available. Evolutionary design doesn't require expensive solutions. The second reframe is about glycemic pattern, not glycemic restriction. The brain doesn't need to be starved of carbohydrates. It needs carbohydrates delivered in forms that don't produce the repeated high-amplitude glucose spikes that drive insulin resistance and suppress metabolic flexibility. Intact whole grains, legumes, and root vegetables aren't the problem. The problem is the wholesale displacement of those ancestral carbohydrate sources by refined and processed equivalents stripped of fiber and structural complexity. A consistent dietary pattern built around lower glycemic, higher fiber carb sources isn't a trendy intervention. It's a structural restoration of what the brain's metabolic system evolved to receive. The third reframe is straightforward. Processed and cured meats don't need to dominate the protein architecture of your diet. They're convenient, they're embedded in food culture. And this isn't about eliminating them entirely, but their role as daily staples creates a chronic, low-level exposure to nitrosamine precursors that the brain doesn't need. Replacing them with less processed protein sources most of the time isn't deprivation. It's simply reducing an unnecessary burden on your neural environment. But there's a fourth piece that emerges naturally from the gut-brain axis we touched on earlier, feeding your microbial allies. You can think of your gut microbiome as a silent partner in brain maintenance. When you include fermented foods like yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, or kimchi, you introduce live beneficial bacteria. When you eat plenty of colorful vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, you provide the prebiotic fibers that those bacteria ferment into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Butyrate, in turn, strengthens the barrier between your gut and your bloodstream, reduces inflammation throughout the body, and signals the brain to increase production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that acts like fertilizer for new neurons. So alongside swapping out the three harmful categories, actively cultivating a diverse gut ecosystem becomes a powerful, science-backed way to support your brain's structural integrity. Now, let's talk about another crucial ally, sleep. We often forget that the brain's cleanup crew works mostly at night. During deep sleep, the glymphatic system, a waste clearance network, flushes out metabolic debris, including amyloid and tau proteins that accumulate in Alzheimer's disease. But here's the connection to diet. Chronic inflammation from seed oils, high insulin from refined carbs, and mitochondrial stress from processed meats all disrupt sleep architecture. They can reduce slow-wave sleep, the phase where this cleanup is most active. So when you eat in ways that trigger low-grade inflammation, you're not only damaging brain tissue directly, you're also impairing the nightly repair cycle that your brain depends on to stay resilient. It's a double hit: more damage, less repair. I want to return to the deeper evolutionary principle because it's easy to hear this information and translate it into anxiety about every food choice. That's the wrong frame. Your body isn't fragile. It's a system built to function under variable and imperfect conditions. The brain has significant resilience, significant compensatory capacity, and a remarkable ability to respond to improved inputs, even in later life. Multiple studies show that dietary pattern changes in adults over 50 produce measurable improvements in inflammatory markers, omega-3 status, and in some cases, brain volume trajectories over periods as short as 12 to 18 months. The brain isn't locked in. It's continuously remodeling. The question is simply what raw materials you're consistently providing for that remodeling. This is the profound insight of evolutionary biology applied to aging. You aren't managing decline. You're managing alignment between an ancient system and a modern environment. And that alignment is more within your influence than most conversations about aging suggest. I want to return to where we began. I told you that by most people's 70s, the brain has undergone measurable physical volume loss. I asked you to consider that this isn't simply an inevitable feature of biological aging. Let me be precise. I'm not suggesting all brain aging is preventable. I'm not claiming dietary change reverses cognitive decline that's already occurred. I'm not making promises about disease prevention. What the evidence supports is something more measured and, I think, more useful than those claims. The rate and degree of structural brain decline in the modern Western world appears to significantly exceed what is driven by aging alone. The gap between what the brain is capable of maintaining with adequate molecular inputs and what it actually maintains in many people eating standard modern diets is meaningful. And a portion of that gap is influenced by consistent dietary patterns accumulated over decades. 3 food categories are doing genuine, measurable structural harm to the aging brain, not through catastrophic events, but through quiet, cumulative molecular displacement, metabolic disruption, and cellular energy interference operating across the exact period of life when the brain's own compensatory systems are under the most evolutionary pressure. Here's what I find most compelling about this, from a scientific standpoint. The solution doesn't require a radical departure from normal human life. it requires a return toward the general dietary composition that allowed a 2 million-year process of neural expansion to occur in the first place. More preformed omega-3s from aquatic and fatty animal sources. Carbohydrates delivered in intact, lower glycemic forms that preserve metabolic flexibility. A reduction in the novel chemical load introduced by industrial preservation techniques. And now we can add a thriving gut ecosystem and deep restorative sleep that together allow the brain to carry out its nightly maintenance. That isn't an extreme program. That's closer to the ancestral mean, to the environment your brain was built for. Your brain didn't shrink because you lack willpower. It didn't drift from its structural potential because of personal failure. It's operating exactly as an evolved biological system should, responding to the inputs most consistently available in its environment. The instinct that drives you toward convenient, palatable, energy-dense food isn't weakness. It's ancient design operating in a novel context. What feels like cognitive vulnerability in midlife and beyond is often ancient design meeting an environment that has drifted too far from the conditions that created it. Understanding that gap is the first meaningful step toward closing it. In the next video, I want to explore something that follows naturally from today's conversation, the question of physical activity and the brain. Because the relationship between movement and brain structure isn't just about cardiovascular health. It involves a set of molecular signaling pathways that are, if anything, even more directly tied to the brain's structural maintenance program than diet alone. And the evolutionary story behind that connection is one that I think most people have never fully heard. Thank you for thinking through this carefully.